Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of westward expansion in the decades leading up to the Civil War. And in this lecture, we're going to be talking about what did the settlers encounter as they stretched out across the West. Primarily, we're going to talk about Native Americans and Mexicans. Of course, the lands that the settlers were moving into were not empty of human beings, but already were filled by Native Americans, numbering some 350,000 or so in the regions west of the Mississippi, about 200 different tribes. And we're going to see in many cases a similar pattern of disease, confusion, and displacement as we've already discussed several times with Indians east of the Mississippi. Most Americans were preconditioned to think of the Native Americans as bloodthirsty savages because popular culture and the art of that era usually depicted them that way. In other cases, they might be viewed as the cliche held of the noble savage. But few Americans attempted to fully develop the idea of Native Americans as human beings. One exception to this was the artist George Catlin, who traveled widely among the Native American civilizations of the West, and in fact lived among them for many years. And upon his return, he began painting portraits of the Native Americans, and like the one you see on the screen. And his paintings always imbued the Indians with pride, nobility, humanity. You couldn't help but have respect for the people in Catlin's paintings, much in contrast to many previous paintings which, as I've noted, depicted the Native Americans as bloodthirsty savages. Catlin was not alone in this age of reform in attempting to alter the ways that Americans typically viewed and treated the Indians. In this era, a mindset was growing that we needed to treat Native Americans with respect and to respect and honor their rights and their possession of the land. One such reformer was William Ellery Channing, who was a minister from Boston. And he attacked the idea of manifest destiny, saying, "We are destined," that is the word, "to overspread North America." And intoxicated with the idea, it matters little to us how we accomplish that fate. And so for reformers like Channing, he thought that Americans needed to act honestly and respectfully toward Indians and try to protect them from further harm. And yet the process of removal, which I described in some previous lectures, continued in this era. Groups from the Midwest and from the far reaches of the South, like Florida, were moved out to the West, much like other tribes had been previously, like the Cherokee, which we discussed. Of note was the resistance of the Seminoles in Florida, whom the United States Army fought a prolonged war against from 1835 to 1842, before finally the majority of the tribe was forced to relocate out to Oklahoma. In other parts of the West, Americans encountered Mexicans who were already there. Much of the American West was Spanish territory until 1821, when Mexico won its independence from Spain. There was also a population of mixed Spanish and Indian heritage called mestizos that were located in other parts of the West as well. So what did the settlers typically think of these kind of groups? Not very highly. There was a considerable amount of racism directed at them. And just as one example, here are the words of Senator Lewis Cass of Michigan when thinking about the prospect of taking over Mexico along with its people. And here's what Lewis Cass said. "We do not want the people of Mexico, either as citizens or as subjects. All we want is a portion of territory, with a population which would soon recede or identify itself with ours." So we're not interested in the people of this territory, we just want the land itself. Still another group that was already out there in lands that the settlers were moving into was in California, which was a land of tremendous opportunity, extremely rich and diverse lands for growing crops. And I've already mentioned briefly the amazing ports located on the coast of California. But in the 1830s, even before the arrival of the settlers, California already had a bustling economy in the form of Mexican ranchers called rancheros. This was a lifestyle filled with gambling, horse racing, bull baiting, and dancing, and their economy was rooted around huge plantations which were worked by Indian slaves. The attrition rate among these Indian slaves was extremely high, about twice the death rate of slaves in the American South. So it was a very cruel and harsh system. So we've seen that wherever it was that settlers were moving into across the West, there were already inhabitants there who would have to adapt and in some ways be dealt with as they encountered the settlers moving in from the east. It's important to note that the regions we're talking about in the 1830s and 40s were relatively sparsely settled, whoever the inhabitants were. And so there was a sense, as I mentioned towards the beginning of these lectures, that a group moving large numbers of its citizens into one of these regions had an opportunity to kind of seize control where there wasn't exactly a void, but there wasn't a large population controlling the territory. And in the instance of Indian tribes like the Comanche and Apaches of the American Southwest, they tended to migrate widely over a territory of hundreds and hundreds of miles. So if a steady population could move in and establish itself, control of these regions was something up for grabs. And that's what we're going to see in the case of Texas. The population in Texas began to grow in the 1820s and into the 1830s as American traders began to establish an alternative trade route across the South as an alternative to the Oregon Trail, which ran a more northerly route, and also induced by the Mexican government, who offered land grants to anyone who wanted to move into that territory, encouraging them to settle the land and develop markets. And so the population began growing of both Americans in Texas and also Hispanic Texans as well. By 1830, there were some 7,000 Americans living in Texas. In 1834, the Americans living in Texas, now numbering close to 30,000, began to organize an effort to separate from Mexico altogether. In 1834, Mexican General Santa Anna staged a coup and took dictatorial powers. And so, meeting the rebellion of the Americans in Texas, Santa Anna decided to crush that rebellion and waged a vicious war against the Americans in Texas. One of the most famous battles occurred at the Alamo in 1836 near San Antonio. The Alamo, defended by Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie, among others. And in this victory for the Mexicans, it was an extremely bloody battle with some 500 Mexicans killed and about 200 Texans killed. Despite defeats like the Battle of the Alamo, Texans still declared their independence from Mexico on March 2nd, 1836, and for a brief time became an independent nation, hence the idea of the Lone Star State. Again, you NFL football fans, you know the star on the side of the Dallas Cowboys helmet. That is derivative of the Lone Star State. The fate of Texas remained up in the air for nearly a decade, and the annexation of Texas into the United States was a very sticky issue. And we're going to be talking much more about these kind of issues moving forward over the next few chapters as we approach the Civil War. Recall that the expansion of slavery is probably the most divisive and pressing issue in the country at that time, ultimately the chief cause of the Civil War itself. So many Northerners opposed the annexation of Texas because they knew, if admitted, it would add one to the number of slave states. And so for a number of years, Texas lingered on as an independent country, which is certainly strange, I think, for us in the present tense to think about. As an independent country, Texas actually began making alliances with foreign nations, among them Great Britain, which became troublesome to the United States itself. It was one thing for Texas to be independent. It was another for it to be forging these kind of alliances with foreign countries. And so in 1844, an election year, the annexation of Texas was one of the biggest issues around that election. A Democrat, James K. Polk, ran on a ticket devoted to expansion, and we're going to be talking much more about Polk in the next lecture. He won the presidential election, and indeed, his term in office marks one of much territorial expansion. So after Polk won the election, the president leaving office, John Tyler, actually oversaw and ushered in the annexation of Texas. He pressured Congress to admit Texas as a joint resolution, which required a simple majority rather than a two-thirds majority required for a treaty. So one of John Tyler's final acts was bringing in Texas. So Texas was annexed at that time, and as we will see in future lectures, it was a source of great debate whether Texas should be admitted to the Union as a slave state or not. We will address those conflicts in future lectures. In the next lecture, we're going to continue talking about James K. Polk and the Mexican War.